Good afternoon. I'm Lark Mason, past chairman of Asia Week and president of the Appraisers Association. And on behalf of Asia Week's chairman, Catherine Martin, and our galleries, museums, and auction house members, welcome to this afternoon's program. Today's panel discussion is one of many sponsored by Asia Week. Please visit our website for information about past and future events, including the exciting array of programs and exhibitions we have scheduled online during this celebration of Asian art in March. And now to our program that will be presented by my friend and colleague, Anu.
Thank you, Lark. Good afternoon. I'm Anu Ghosh Mazumdar, head of the Indian and Southeast Asian Department at Sotheby's. On behalf of Asia Week New York, it has been a great privilege for me to put together this panel and serve as its moderator. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists and to our audience. The title of our webinar is Tales in Connoisseurship, Appreciating Indian Paintings. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to outline the subject of our discussion and how we will approach it. Our topic is Indian paintings. These are, for the most part, works on paper that were produced in different regions of the Indian subcontinent, anywhere between the 14th through the 19th centuries. The time period itself may be described as late medieval or pre-modern, and these works are often variously referred to as Indian miniature paintings or Indian court paintings. We have chosen to simply call them Indian paintings because that is what they are. These paintings, depicting both religious and secular themes, were created as groups of works assembled into albums, for the most part. Indian paintings are widely described as magical. I think we will all agree that the depth, diversity, and variety of these works is unlike anything else in the world. They are unique. Any market or collecting category, whether it's Indian paintings or any other area, stands on the shoulders of three key participants: the collector, the art dealer, and the curator. How fortunate are we to have exactly such a trifecta of eminent speakers gracing our panel this evening. Collector Dr. Gursharan Sidhu will speak about his lifelong passion in the pursuit of Indian paintings. Art dealer and consultant Brendan Lynch will give us a glimpse into the forensics and research that go into identifying these works and their provenance. And finally, curator Dr. Marika Sardar will touch upon the interpretation or reinterpretation of collections or parts of collections when they leave the private world of the collector and enter the public domain of the museum. I will introduce each of our guests and invite them to present. At the end of the presentations, we will open the forum for discussion. I would like to invite our audience to please submit your questions through the Q&A chat box on your screens. I will do my best to collate all your questions and place them before our panelists. This program will be recorded. And now I hope everyone is strapped in and ready to begin your journey into the magical world of Indian paintings. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. Gursharan S. Sidhu. Gursharan holds degrees from the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Madras, and Stanford University. After a long career in academia and the technology sector, Apple and Microsoft, he now focuses on his lifelong passion for the arts of India. He and his wife, Elvira, collect traditional and vernacular paintings from India and art from Mexico. Gursharan was formerly co-chairman of the board of the Smithsonian Institution's Freer and Sackler Galleries and is currently a member of the board of trustees of the Seattle Art Museum, as well as the acquisitions committee of the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. He is a member of the board of trustees of MAP, Museum for Art and Photography, Bangalore. Welcome, Gursharan.
Thank you, Anu. It's a pleasure to, let's see if I've been enabled. Yeah, okay. I want to start by thanking Asia Week and Sotheby's for organizing this panel. It's a topic of great joy and pleasure for Elvira and myself. And Anu, thanks very much for that introduction. First, let me say what my goal is today. My goal really is to help young collectors, young aesthetes who want to buy and live with art, but feel a little bit bewildered about how to go about it. I'm going to do this by telling them some snippets from our own collecting story, and through those to make a couple of simple but really important points. I bought my first painting, next please. Next, yes, that one. I bought my first painting in 1969 while I was still a graduate student at Stanford. Now, this was a year before Elvira and I met, but she very quickly fell in love with this form of art. Elvira is from Mexico, by the way. Now, it's been a joint venture over these many decades. Before I sort of get into our own story, let me make a couple of important points that came to me while preparing. People collect for many reasons. One, of course, is that art can be a status symbol. You know, it's a way of sort of signaling that they have made it. That is really not why we collected art. There is a different motivation, and that's the one that drove us into this venture. And that is that some works of art provoke a very special excitement in one's mind when you see them, whether you're in a museum, looking in a book, looking at auction catalogs, or increasingly on the internet. Now, this kind of collecting is closely tied to the notion of being a connoisseur, which has connotations, good and bad, but let's just sort of focus on what it is. It really is a desire to own and live with and enjoy the excitement of works of art. Now, clearly, for me to sort of discuss this in a very short period of time is very demanding. If you've collected for 50 years, as we have, and done it fairly steadily, you end up with a pretty substantial collection. So choosing what to show you has been hard. You know, I could have done what, you know, some people may have suggested. Hey, pick the ones that you find most exciting and show them to us. Well, yes, I could have done that. But instead, I want to keep the focus through the half a dozen or so pictures that I'll be showing you on really how this kind of collecting, in which you want to enjoy the thrill, the frisson of interacting with a work of art, how one can go about it, what are its characteristics. It always starts, as far as I understand it, from knowing many collectors, with a particular triggering event. It's sort of that moment of discovering that art form. I'll tell you about how this happened for me. It happened by sheer chance in the 1950s. I wasn't even a teenager when at the house of a very distinguished scholar, I saw a photograph of an Indian painting. I knew nothing about Indian paintings at that time. Well, but this particular painting absolutely stunned me. And it triggered my interest in these kinds of paintings. Now, if that is all that would have happened, it, you know, would not, the story would sort of end there, but it didn't. Next, please. Some couple of decades, maybe 2 or 3 decades later, in 1983, a second happenstance occurred. Elvira and I were walking along Union Street in San Francisco, stepped into a rugs gallery. We had just bought a house, so it made sense. And by chance, I asked the owner, do you have any Indian paintings? And the most stunning thing happened. He said, yes, I do. And he put in front of me the self-same painting whose photograph I had seen in the 1950s. Next, please. This was the painting that triggered things. Of course, we acquired it right away, and it remains one of our most favorite things. Now, it isn't hard to understand why this particular picture grabbed me even in the very early formative years. It's lush, it's beautifully colored, it's wonderfully composed. It invites you to explore endlessly. Now, if that were sort of the only thing needed, a triggering event, then, you know, collecting would be very simple. It takes much more because you can't just rely on luck. You know, it becomes sort of, collecting becomes a mystical activity where, you know, one lucky event after another leads to a collection. It doesn't work that way. It takes much more, especially for art from Asia. And let me sort of bring in the next point. The works of art from India in particular, and this is probably true for China and Japan also, from what I have seen, are in their dominant majority relating stories of various faiths or of kings and noblemen, their lives. And if you don't know anything about those, they are sort of just very beautiful, lovely, well-executed pieces of paper. It takes much more, and that is what I call preparation. You have to read, you have to acquire books, go to museums, coax, do whatever you have to see as many paintings as you can. By the way, all these remarks are not for the seasoned collectors, but for the young ones whom I want to encourage to explore this form of collecting. Now, when you do that, you end up becoming quite well prepared. Then what happens is, next one, please. Next slide. Basically, you go from that triggering event that arouses your curiosity, you end up getting prepared, and then you start creating your own luck, because your preparation starts meeting a myriad opportunities you will find. And that confluence of preparation with opportunity is what lets you, over time, start having more works of art with which you just enjoy that experience, the thrill of a great work of art. So these are the two key points I want to make. And having made them, now let me show you how this worked for us in a few instances for Elvira and myself. And that way, I hope I've given you something interested in the few minutes available to me. Next slide, please. In 1978, we were living in Mexico City, and on a visit to the Bay Area, we became aware of collectors of Indian paintings, two artists, William Theophilus Brown and Paul Warner. And I somehow got introduced to Bill Brown, and he showed me a number of paintings for the very fine collection. And in passing, he mentioned, you know, we are getting to a certain age that we are selling off some works. And he put this one in front of me and said, would you like to have it? Now, let me share with you a little bit about this painting and why we immediately, instantaneously bought it from him. Neither Elvira nor I grew up in the Greco-Roman kind of tradition of art, the highly refined world of art. We grew up with bright colors in Mexico and in India, and very robust compositions. The days of the Mughals were long over. Brendan will show you some fantastic things from that period. But we grew up in a world where something like this, something that reminded me of Gauguin and Van Gogh, and would certainly have thrilled Mondrian and Klee with the way primary colors have been put to effect. And that's really why this appealed to us. To this day, it remains a favorite. Look carefully, and you will find something. Indian paintings reveal their secrets very slowly. You have to look and look and look. Look at the snakes. They sort of look like Islamic calligraphy. Point number one. Point number two, the story narrative proceeds from right to left. On the right, Krishna is dancing on the hood of the snake, Kalia, whom he has dominated. Kalia and his gang have been polluting the river and making life miserable. He, the little child Krishna, being a god incarnate, has humiliated, humbled Kalia, and then his wise serpents ask him to please let Kalia go and live. Krishna agrees. They accept and they offer their devotion in the middle, and then they slink off to the left to no longer bother people. That's how the narrative proceeds. It took us years to sort of realize that. And that's how one learns. More than that, I will now state a conclusion that no curator will attempt, no scholar will, that perhaps the artist was Muslim and used to writing right to left, and so composed the painting from right to left. That is how the artist would read or compose what they wrote. And so he or she, probably a he, did it for the painting. So this is the way, you have to dig into Indian paintings. Now, let's move on. Next slide, please. In '79, passing through New York City, I stopped over at the gallery of Doris Wiener, an absolutely fantastic dealer with great taste, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And she was away, but her assistant was unpacking a crate, and out of it came this dramatic painting. Now, if you know nothing about Indian mythology, and any youngster today would look at it and say, gee, it's Godzilla fighting Kong. But that's not what it is, as any Indian would know. It is really a scene of great drama. A demon, Hiranyaksha, on the right, the green-bodied one, has the one with the golden eye, that's what his name says, had become extremely overweeningly proud, had stolen the earth, hidden it under the cosmic ocean, and all creation was in danger. The great god Vishnu decided to come down to earth. And since he had to look for the earth, he was incarnate as a wild boar. Now, we all know about the pigs of Perigord looking for truffles. Well, this is a much older story, and here the reward was not a truffle, but all of existence. And Varaha fought Hiranyaksha against the cosmic ocean, defeats him, and restores things back to normalcy. Well, all that is fun and games, but look at this artist's brilliance. There is no precedent for this painting anywhere in Indian art. A series of paintings of this theme was made by Manaku, the great artist. We are pretty sure it's by Manaku in the mid-1700s. And most of them are in Lahore, in the museum, or in Chandigarh in India. One or two escaped, and this is one of them, having been bought in 1925 by a very famous artist in Lahore. And that's the place from where it came to us. Next slide, please. So now let me change to the other big thread of Indian paintings, And these are paintings of the kings, their stories, and those noblemen. And I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to switch to 19th century paintings for a very specific reason. When we were collecting, the common norm was earlier paintings are better. 19th century is a period of degeneration and not worthy of spending your money on. We were very lucky that that bias existed because we were able to just cherry pick absolutely phenomenal works from that period. This one came from the great scholar, dealer, and aesthete, Mark Zabrowski, and his partner, Bob Alderman. And with this painting, Mark steered me away from our first loves of Pahadi paintings from the Punjab hills into the world of Rajput painting. This is by a very great artist, another great one, Chokha, who painted Maharao Bhim Singh, whose family of rulers in Mewar, and you all know about Mewar without knowing it maybe, is where the Lake Palace hotel is, that you've seen wonderful pictures of it, and some of you have stayed there. His family is descended from the sun god, Surya. And so the emblem in his wonderful palatial room is a solar disk in the back. And he is sitting there, probably looking out at the Lake Palace while his children play just before his throne chair. It is a symphony of whites and grays by a very great artist, and he's a great master, remains one of our absolute favorites. Let me move on since time is running short, and I want to show you a few more things. Now, this game of 19th century paintings didn't only happen in major centers like Mewar. Next slide, please. At another court, the court of Kota, phenomenal paintings were made. And this one is from around 1835, maybe even 4 or 5 years later. The British now are the overlords of all of India. The Maharajas, who used to be complete absolute rulers in their own principalities, are now subject to the control of the British, who have very astutely, since they are very few in number, the British, let the Maharajas run their principalities as long as they behave themselves. And within their principalities, they are free to enjoy the fruits of their state's production, song and dance, painting, arts, hunt, and so on and so forth are their domain. They continue to be leaders of their people, spiritual and temporal. And here, for instance, is Maharao Ram Singh, a distinguished aesthete and patron of the arts. At the festival of Holi in the early spring, he and his noblemen on horseback are tossing colored powder at each other, celebrating a great victory of good over evil. Absolutely wonderful. Now, this painting is hanging right behind my head. It's a nice sized painting, and this will help those who are kind of been afflicted with the use of the term miniature painting for Indian paintings to stop using that absolutely ridiculous term. There is nothing miniature about these paintings. It's just an old archaism that I think needs to die a noble death now. Let's move on. Next slide, please. This came very recently to us. By the way, the previous one came from Terence McInerney, a dear friend who's become a dear friend, an absolutely distinguished dealer and a great scholar. This one comes from a London gallery, Prahlad Babbar, another wonderful dealer. And this was acquired very recently. It comes from a very small principality called Ratlam. In fact, very few paintings have come from there. Brendan himself had one for sale, and Elvira and I have acquired 2 this year. There are very few of them. Now, this is a tiny place. It's the 1820s, 1827, in fact, is approximately when I think it can be very definitively be dated to that date. And this guy has a tiny little principality, but he still has to put on the show of being the religious leader of his community, to have their faith in him as a leader. And here he is at the fall festival of Dussehra that celebrates the victory of Lord Ram over Ravana, where he is sacrificing a buffalo to Durga, the goddess, the mother goddess. Now, it's a complex picture, and it will take Elvira and myself a few months to keep on looking at it to get all its mysteries understood. But I did want to share with you the excitement even in small principalities. Let's move on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is the final thing I'll show you today, because I'm sure Brendan and Marika are fidgeting at the time I'm using up. This is also not, this was acquired in 2018, but this is from South India. Not many paintings are to be found in private collections from Southern India. We were thrilled to acquire it. Now you see in the previous painting, an offering was being made to the mother goddess. Well, here she is. She's furious. She's destroying the forces of evil, not simply by killing them, but she is picking them up and swallowing them. The whole theme of the female energy as the great power in creation is alive and well in India. And this is a painting made in the sort of the 1840 timeframe, 1825 to 40, depending on which art historian's biases we pay attention to. And you don't need to know anything much about the story. You can just revel in the artist's incredibly powerful creation. So let me leave you with a few of these thoughts. No period of history, we have paintings from the 13th to the late 19th century. No period is lesser than another. Just look for the great ones that give you the frisson, and that becomes a pretty good guide. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gursharan, for sharing those delectable jewels from your collection and for taking us through the journey of serendipity meets luck meets preparation, all culminating in these treasures from your 52-year-long love affair with Indian art. And thank you too for taking us through some of the stories of the Krishna Leela and the Bhagavad as well. Our next speaker is Brendan Lynch, a London-based dealer in Indian and Islamic art. Brendan spent 20 years at Sotheby's, working in London and New York, and was director of the Islamic and Indian art department. In 1998, he set up with his former colleague, Oliver Forge, an art consultancy dealing and acting as agents in Indian and Islamic art and art of the ancient world. The company has exhibited Indian paintings annually at Asia Week, New York since 2009. Welcome, Brendan.
Thank you so much, Anu. I shall speak today about 5 exceptionally fine Indian paintings from geographically diverse schools that we have sold over the past 10 years at Asia Week, New York. We worked closely with the well-known scholar J.P. Losty, whose valuable academic research on these works I'd just like to acknowledge. The first painting you see on the screen is a party of hunters returning to camp, which is a leaf from the British Library, Chester Beatty Library, Akbar Nama, and dates from 1603 to 04. On a spring day in 2010, I took the Eurostar to Paris and had lunch at a brasserie in the Avenue Victor Hugo with an octogenarian collector. Afterwards, as was his habit, we went to his apartment nearby, threading our way through lavish rooms of Louis XV's furniture and amongst other treasures, a collection of pictures by the Swiss artist Lyotard. We entered his library, a room lined with Indian paintings and Islamic pottery from Turkey. Producing this wonderful painting, he announced that he wished us to sell it on his behalf and that he considered it one of his greatest treasures, a leaf from the 1603 to 04 Akbar Nama manuscript, which we then exhibited in New York and sold to the Louvre Abu Dhabi in 2012. Akbar was the third and perhaps greatest Mughal emperor. He reigned during the second half of the 16th century. A brilliant military strategist, he was a religious pluralist and expanded his empire into most of the subcontinent as we know it today. Akbar had a passion for all the arts, but his greatest love was painting, and the imperial ateliers came to comprise thousands of artists, many of whom are known by name and celebrated. You could have the next slide, please. One of his greatest artistic achievements was the commissioning of the Akbar Nama, a chronicle of his age, by his friend and court historian Abul Fazl. 3 versions survive and date to about 1589, 1595, and the one we're in fact dealing with, 1603 to 04. Return from the hunt is an unusual and engaging subject, painted in an exceptionally vibrant palette, allowing a glimpse into the practicalities of the hunt, or shikar, in the imperial Mughal world. Could I have the next slide, please? Though unattributed, the vivid use of color and the level of interaction between the figures are hallmarks of the younger generation of painters such as Balchand, Govardhan, and Daulat, who were active in the early years of the 17th century. We could have the next slide, please. A point of particular interest are the borders, which were in fact added to the painting by the Belgian-born French dealer Georges-Joseph de Motte prior to 1923. A celebrated dealer of his time, he was painted by Matisse in 1918, and this is the portrait you see on the screen, and dealt mainly in medieval art before dying at the age of 46 in a boar shooting accident. Could I have the next slide, please? This will show you the actual border of the painting. Today, de Motte is infamous for having split up and sold many royal Mughal, Persian, and Ottoman manuscripts, reusing the borders from this Persian dictionary, the Farhang-i Jahangiri, which dates from 1607 to 1608, and this is one of his hallmarks. The presence of this border enabled us to take the provenance of this painting back to the early 20th century. We could move on to the next slide, please, which is the next painting, which comes from Bikaner and depicts Madhavanala swooning before Kamakandala. It's inscribed work of the imperial master, and it comes from Bikaner and dates from about 1670. This unusual and compellingly beautiful painting comes from the desert state of Bikaner on the borders of Pakistan and Rajasthan. The well-known collector Paul Walter owned this painting for 30 years, finally selling it at auction in 2002, when it was bought by Jeremy and Britta Lloyd in London. Mr. Walter, a great connoisseur of painting, of Indian painting, had purchased it in 1972 from William Wolfe, a Madison Avenue dealer who was wily and engaging in equal measure, but whose eagle eye uncovered an endless stream of masterpieces in both Indian painting and bronzes from the 1960s to the 1980s. The Lloyds had formed a small but highly selective collection in the 1970s and 80s, mainly acquired at Colnagi's in London, which we sold in 2011, including this painting, which is now in a private collection. A favorite of Indian painting, the subject depicts the traditional love story between the young Brahmin Madhavanala, who was exiled from his country by a king who envied the handsome youth his success with women. On his travels, he encountered the beautiful courtesan Kamakandala, and they fell desperately in love. But tragedy struck. Believing her lover had died, she kills herself, and then he, hearing of her demise, follows suit. Here, however, prior to its operatic conclusion, we have a scene from happier times with an atmospheric depiction of the moment when the youth, disguised as a musician, first glimpses Kamakandala and faints, so overwhelmed is he by her beauty. We could see the next slide, please. In this spectacular version of the scene, while the lithe-bodied youth lies in a dead faint, his veena cast aside, Kalakandala is seen at the focal point of the painting, which the artist has contrived into a triangular corner. Radiantly ensconced at the Jaroka window of a gilded rooftop pavilion at the level of the treetops, she is as if in a shrine. We could see the next slide, please. With her forefinger raised to her mouth in amazement at the beauty of the youth, 6 of her ladies gather round her in consternation. 2 putti supporting her pavilion leave no doubt that amorous emotions are at play, and the sky of scudding and dramatically polychrome clouds reflects their disturbed nature. In the course of the 17th century, the artists of the desert state of Bikaner absorbed both Mughal and Deccani influences through political influence and military campaigns. A painter confidently signing as the imperial master does not disappoint. And as the name implies, he had probably migrated to Bikaner from the Mughal court at Delhi. Here, a highly sophisticated design that creates a magnificent and atmospheric scene painted in impeccable detail is testament to a school of painting at its zenith. If we could move to the next slide, please, and the next painting. In this rare and highly unusual painting, fairies descend from the heavens to visit the chamber of Prince Manohar. It is, in fact, a folio from the Rose Garden of Love, a text by Nusrati, and comes from the Deccan and dates from about 1700. This is one of 7 folios from this fascinating Deccani manuscript, which was sold to Christie's in London in 1979. The unpublished colophon notes that the work was written by an unnamed author who, quote, lived during the reign of Ali Adil Shah, under whom I grew prosperous, unquote. Identified by Daniel Enbom in 1985 as the work of Nusrati, after 32 years in the Lloyd collection in London, we exhibited at Asia Week, New York in 2011, when it was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. Written by Nusrati, court poet to Sultan Ali Adil Shah II in 1657 to 58, The Rose Garden of Love tells the story of Prince Manohar's quest to attain Madhumalati, whom he fell for in a dream. Its title evokes the heady atmosphere of the 17th century Bijapur court, where the arts flourished under a succession of Adil Shah sultans. We could have the next slide, please. Dramatically set in a white marble palace, this evocative night scene depicts an episode where the fairy swooped down to the sleeping princess and her maid, who you can see here in the slide. As Navina Haidar of the Metropolitan Museum has written of this painting, the central poetic metaphor of the garden as the setting for romantic and spiritual union is important to the style of the painting, unquote. We could see the next slide, please. In a unique and ingenious artistic device, the somersaulting fairies occupy a plane of color on the left, whereas the mythical palace and sleeping princess are evoked in ethereal white and silver on the right. The style of this painting reflects the moment when the grand traditions of 17th century Deccan painting are transitioning to the Hyderabad school of the 18th. We could move to the next slide, please, and the fourth painting. This is a folio from the large Basholi Bhagavad Purana series, depicting Krishna and Balarama conversing with Nanda on a terrace. And it was painted either at Basholi or Gula in about 1765. The Nobel Prize-winning author, Sir V.S. Naipaul, was born of Indian heritage in Trinidad and Tobago and settled in Britain, having studied at Oxford. Despite, or perhaps because of a troubled relationship with India intellectually, as described in his 1964 book, An Area of Darkness, he began collecting Indian painting, and in 2014, his collection was published privately. Amongst paintings we sold on his behalf was this superb Pahari painting of circa 1765. We could see the painting, which is the next slide. Thank you. Actually, I'm sorry, this is the catalogue from which the series came originally. This painting comes from a celebrated series of several hundred folios that was dispersed at auction in London in 1960. The property of a now mysterious Mrs. F.K. Smith, between 2 and 4 folios were sold in each of the 93 lots in an unillustrated catalogue. They fetched on average £15 sterling at the time, and many of them were bought by the London book dealers Maggs Brothers. You can see the next painting. Next slide, please. The painting was acquired by Sir Vidya from Colnaghi's in 1979 and was sold by us in 2016 and is now in an American private collection. Originally written in Sanskrit and dating from before the 10th century, the Bhagavad Purana is one of Hinduism's greatest works. Its central philosophy is devotion to the blue-skinned god Krishna, who conquers evil forces. Here, following the slaying of Kamsa, the wicked king of Mathura, Krishna and his brother Balarama are depicted talking to their stepfather Nanda, 4 young cowherds seated behind him, whilst telling their followers seated to their right to return with them to Braj, near Mathura, Krishna's birthplace. They are seated on an architectural dais with a single flowering prunus at either side. A neutral background and slender streaked sky contrast with the vivid colors of the subject's clothes and a vibrant red border. Generations of scholars have struggled to decide whether this series was painted at Basholi or Gula. In terms of artists, it is sometimes attributed to Fatu, son of the great painter Manaku, but generally described as the first generation after Manaku and Nainsook. We could have the next slide, please. Succinctly described by J.P. Losty as having succumbed to the charms of a softer Mughal-influenced type of painting style from Gula, unquote, the earlier influences can easily be read. These can be discerned in the vibrant palette, the individuality of the portraits, the lively interaction between the figures, and the appearance of 3/4 view faces, 3 of which can be seen here. If we could move to the next slide, please. This is a leaf from the Impi album and depicts a blossom-headed parakeet on a branch of the Karonda shrub. It was painted by Zain al-Din and at Calcutta in 1777. The story of the Impi collection of natural history drawings is one of the most compelling in the history of Indian art. It marks a very significant beginning of what is known as company school painting. Between 1770 and 1830, an age of enlightenment generation came to positions of power in Bengal, drawn by the magnet of trade and opportunity that was the lifeblood of the British Empire in India. Within the city of Calcutta, called Qatar today, as its epicenter, As its Palladian architecture transformed the city, a group of gentlemen scholars embraced indigenous Indian culture in all its forms. They learned Persian, Hindustani, Bengali, and even Sanskrit. They studied, and in some cases converted to, Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism. At the center of this was Sir William Jones, a brilliant linguist and scholar, and a Supreme Court judge who founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal a year after his arrival in Calcutta in 1784. You can see the next slide, please. So Elijah Impey, a Cambridge graduate, was appointed first Chief Justice of Bengal in 1774, having learned Bengali, Urdu, and Persian. From 1777, his wife Mary began to employ local artists to record some of the birds and to a lesser extent animals in the menagerie and aviary of her extensive Calcutta garden. Of the three partner artists she patronized, Zain al-Din is considered the most skilled, and it was he who painted this stunningly beautiful parakeet. You could see the next slide, please, which shows Lady Impey in her Calcutta drawing room. Lady Impey was very precise in that the birds depicted had to be viewed in their naturalistic habitat, drawn from life and where possible of actual size. Importantly, each was inscribed in English and Persian with her name, those of the species and the artist, as well as the date. This, along with the great skill of the three artists, is what made the Impey album so exceptional, and it caused a sensation amongst the scientific community when the Impeys returned with it to London in 1783. You can see the last slide, please, showing one of the inscriptions. Some 326 paintings were originally commissioned, of which 197 were studies of birds, 76 of fish, 28 of reptiles, and 8 of flowers. With the death of Sir Elijah in 1809, the album was dispersed at auction at Phillips in London in 1810. Many are in the world's great art museums and in private collections today. This completes my presentation. Many thanks to Asia Week New York for inviting me to speak today.
Connoisseurship is described as the language of the eye. Thank you, Brendan, for walking us through the many visual details of these remarkable treasures and sharing the stories attached to them. They are as interesting as the works themselves. I particularly loved hearing all about the Impey album created in my hometown of Calcutta. Our final speaker this evening is Dr. Marika Sardar, curator at the Aga Khan Museum. Marika has previously worked at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, the San Diego Museum of Art, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Major exhibitions include Interwoven Globe 2013, focusing on the worldwide textile trade from the 16th through 18th centuries, Sultans of Deccan India 1500 to 1750 in 2015, examining the artistic traditions of the Muslim sultanates of Central India, and Epic Tales from Ancient India 2016, looking at narrative traditions and the illustration of texts from South Asia. Marika has recently published, along with John Saylor and Audrey Trushka, the Mughal-era Persian language manuscript of the Ramayana in the collection of the Museum of Islamic Art, Doha. Welcome, Marika.
Thank you so much, Anu. It's really a pleasure to be a part of today's program, and thank you to all of you in the audience. It looks like we have a great group here this evening. So I suppose in my presentation, I could continue the story of making acquisitions that's been described by my two fellow co-panelists by talking about the museum curator's perspective on acquisitions and collecting. But really after that initial moment, the frisson that Dr. Sidhu described, it involves mostly a lot of convincing committees and writing out forms and paperwork. And it can actually be only a very small part of one's job, depending on the museum that you're in. And actually most of what we do involves interpreting the objects that have been collected by others, whether that's the good, the bad, or the ugly. So my role on the panel today is to speak to the refocus or re-emphasis of collections when they enter the museum and are used in different ways to reach different audiences. And I happen to have worked at 3 museums really profoundly shaped by the 3 individuals who gave their collections of Indian paintings to them. So that's the San Diego Museum of Art, the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, and now the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. So, and I will note that the collectors I'm speaking of, I never had the chance to actually meet, but I am very well aware that my co-panelists and many of you in the audience did know them well. So I'd be happy to hear your personal recollections about them or other perspectives you might have on their collections in the Q&A period. So next slide, please. I'll be discussing these collections in the order that I myself encountered them. So that would start with Edwin Binney III and the San Diego Museum. Binney was born in 1925, and he came from the family that owned the Crayola Crayon Company, and this was the source of the family's fortunes. He studied at Harvard, getting a PhD there in 1961. And I mention this because there was certainly something in the air in the Boston, Cambridge area at this particular moment in time. This was just a generation after the MFA's collection of Indian art had been invigorated by curator Ananda Kumaraswamy and the patron Denman Waldo Ross. And only a few years after Indian art world luminaries Stuart Cary Welch and Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan had passed through Harvard as well. And there's no doubt that all of this activity got Ed Binney interested in art from the non-Western world. And by 1958, he was making purchases in this field. Next slide, please. From what I understand, Binney devised a master plan for his collection and how it would grow. He had a matrix of all the major schools of South Asian painting and set out to collect at least 2 examples from each one in order to have full coverage. That included things on the very early end of the spectrum, including this manuscript. We see the covers, but the complete manuscript is in the collection, and it's dated to 1138, and he bought up to the 19th century as well. Next slide, please. At the museum now, there's a wonderful archive of Binney's notes on each painting. He mentions when and where he bought them, what other collectors or museums had something similar, and where each one had been previously exhibited or published. Next slide, please. He also left personal notes that help us understand his interest in each one and to give us a sense of the triumph he felt each time he purchased one. So not only was this example, a fabulous signed portrait of the Emperor Shah Jahan, but it was a major investment and something won after much spirited bidding. Next slide, please. From these notes, we also learn of his interest in the kind of things that other collectors weren't yet buying, such as this 19th century copy of the Bhagavad Purana commissioned by the Maharaja of Mysore, Krishna Wodeyar III. It's full of lively paintings, next slide please, on which Binney commented, "This is fabulous. The range of illustrations is quite incredible." At the time he bought the manuscript, South Asia was off the map for most collectors, and it still only forms a small part of North American museum collections. And certainly 1840 would have been considered far too late for the best phase of Indian painting. Once these objects entered the museum in 1990, their rarity and what they meant personally to Binney became of secondary importance. The San Diego Museum has great collections of European, American, and East Asian art, so the Binney collection was subsumed into this larger narrative about world traditions of art. Next slide, please. In 2016, just as I was leaving the museum, we undertook a major reshuffling of the galleries, at which point the South and Southeast Asian collections were installed in this nice, bright and airy space. And the Binney collection was grounded in stories about different moments of artistic production from the region, starting with a sculpture like you see here, that was religious in nature, and then moving on to later periods when the courts became the center for production. Next slide, please. So here in this alcove, just next to the space you've seen, and where they could be protected from light, there's space to display about 20 of the over 1,450 paintings that Binney gave to the museum at any given time. And the intention was to include a chronological and geographical range in each rotation, but really that's not what, at least I at the time, was focusing on in the labels. It's more about the stories that each painting told, much like my panelists have shared, sort of telling you what the manuscript it came from is and who the characters are in each painting and what it is that they're doing. You know, much more than talking about styles and the artists or the patrons. Next slide, please. I'll also just quickly note that as part of this reorganization, we installed a set of open storage galleries with drawers of paintings, allowing us to give just a few more paintings out of the large collection to visitors at any given time. Next slide, please. The next collector and museum I encountered was Sheik Saud Al Fannie of Qatar and the magnificent Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. Sheikh Saud was born in 1966 and educated in Beirut and Doha, and had become interested in collecting art at a young age. His niece, Sheikha Mayasa, who is now chairperson of the Qatar Museums Authority, has recounted that one of his early inspirations was his aunt, Sheikha Amna, who also collected art. As Minister for Culture, Arts and Heritage, Sheikh Saud was responsible for building up the national collections of Qatar and was buying on a scale much broader than just Indian painting. The objects he was collecting were intended to support museums of photography, natural history, Orientalism, and of course, Islamic art, among many others. And he entered into the market in a big way in the 1990s. So this was quite a different era from when Ed Binney was making his acquisitions. And there were still many hidden gems coming up for sale, but at this time, the market was quite established and there was a rich body of scholarship to support our interest in different schools of South Asian painting. While this era has sometimes been characterized in a negative way as Arab purchasers buying up large amounts of objects, Sheikh Saud's collecting methods were deliberate, as an exhibition now on view at the Museum of Islamic Art aims to demonstrate. It is called the Falcons Eye, and along with the accompanying catalog that includes recollections from those who knew him well, it attempts to reinstate the intentionality and intellect with which he worked. Next slide, please. He did, for instance, take a particular liking to Indian painting, and one of his most spectacular purchases was this manuscript, a copy of the Ramayana in Persian language translation that was once owned by the Queen Hamida Banu Begum, wife of the Mughal Emperor Humayun and mother of Emperor Akbar. This information comes from a note written on the bottom of the page on the screen now, which states that it was transferred from her estate to the main imperial library after Hamida Banu's death in 1604. Next slide. We don't have the same type of documentation for Sheikh Saud's collection as we do for Edwin Binney's, but I've heard from those close to him at the time that this manuscript was dear to his heart. I understand that this was in part because of the paintings, some quite beautifully executed and others less so, but nonetheless bold and vigorous and quite appealing. Next slide. The manuscript's attraction for Sheikh Saud also lay in its connection to the Mughal imperial family. As he noted in an interview about his general approach to collecting, he said, quote, "I go by masterpieces, pieces from an important church, a major family, a great collection. These really interest me. They have a history and a provenance." And so that connection right there, documented at the beginning of the manuscript to Hamida Banu and then a succession of other owners, would have been a major source of attraction. And he made it a special project to obtain as many as possible of the leaves that had been previously removed from the manuscript and sold individually. So now today in the Museum of Islamic Art, 41 of the original 56 paintings have been reunited with the text. Now, as far as showing this manuscript in a museum, the Museum of Islamic Art, which opened in 2008, takes a jewel box approach with works of art displayed as masterpieces, each in their own bespoke glass showcase and shown in dramatically lit galleries. Next slide, please. In terms of didactic messaging, the museum reflects the combined visions of two different directors. So one takes a thematic and medium-based approach, and the other arranges things by geography and dynasty. So there are two sets of galleries organized along these lines. So here you would encounter material from South Asia in many different contexts, in galleries focusing on calligraphy, architectural decoration, or other themes, as well as in a space labeled, your South Asian gallery. But really the emphasis was meant to be on the extraordinary nature of each object in the collection, and thus the overall glory of Islamic art, rather than a specific cultural context. I myself found it a challenge to work within the physical constraints of these galleries, gorgeous as they were. And we also started a reorganization project meant to coincide with the museum's 10th anniversary, but that is still ongoing today. And in this kind of reapproach to the collections, we wanted to really rethink and give a more historical context to the works of art. And in this way, I found it a challenge to talk about South Asian history only through objects relating to its Muslim dynasties. Many of us have discussed the difficulties of a field called Islamic art, but the artificiality of its boundaries becomes even more apparent when it's separated out this way and displayed as an independent subject, without a way to represent the other cultures present in the region. In this context, the Ramayana manuscript became then a means to at least hint at the majority religion of India and to make the point that its Muslim rulers and their artists did not operate in a vacuum, speaking only to artistic and literary traditions from the rest of the Islamic world. Unexpectedly for me, though, were some sensitivities around how the manuscript could be displayed. Although it had been expressly acquired for the museum and had been deemed appropriate, at least by Sheik Saud, one had to be careful about how its contents were presented. We could not speak about gods, for instance. These were characters in a story, and we couldn't talk about its religious content. And there were sensitivities about nudity as well, which ruled out our showing most of the paintings of Sita. I should note, though, that these kinds of restrictions applied only to the gallery context, and we didn't face these kinds of restraints when putting together our recent publication. Now in my present position at the Aga Khan Museum, next slide, please. I find myself again working within the framework of a museum dedicated to Islamic art, but in this case, the museum uses art to talk more broadly about cross-cultural connections and to share a message about plurality in Muslim cultures. The collector most closely associated with the museum is Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, who lived from 1933 until 2003. He was a member of the Aga Khan family, and his father was spiritual leader of the Ismaili community, a role that his nephew, Prince Karim, now holds. Prince Sadruddin himself served in many public and philanthropic roles, including UN High Commissioner for Refugees between 1966 and 77. As for his collecting activities, he, much like Ed Binney, started making acquisitions in the 1950s at a fairly early point in the development of the market. We don't have an extensive archive relating to his purchases at the museum. That's not really our focus. But there are prefaces in the various catalogs of his collections published along the years that give an idea of his inspirations. He mentions, for instance, the example of his grandmother in Bombay, who had many Persian language manuscripts. And he also says that he owes much to his mentor, Stuart Cary Welch. As mentioned before, the two met at Harvard, and this is how Prince Sadruddin first became interested in buying Indian and Islamic art. Among his significant acquisitions was this Quran, next slide please, that has a colophon providing the information that it was completed at the fort of Gwalior in the year 1399. This is a landmark for our understanding of a period when Islamic modes of projection were taking hold and transforming the nature of manuscripts being made in the Indian subcontinent. Next slide, please. The painting in this case takes the form of illumination and shows the meeting of different ancient traditions coming together to make a new tradition, much as we can observe in figural painting of the period. The second important manuscript is this copy of the Athlokainaseri. Next slide, please. Attributed to the Mughal court in the 1590s. It's illustrated with 17 paintings, including this image of a contemporary paintings workshop in action. The text was written in the 13th century for an Ismaili patron, and it provides instruction for rulers and their advisors. Next slide. The subject matter does not lend itself easily to illustration, but the artist gamely provided images relating to the parables mentioned in the text, relating them to scenes of daily life in the Mughal period. And as I mentioned, we don't have notes from Prince Sadruddin on individual items, so I wouldn't personally know the significance of such a manuscript to him, but I'm guessing that between the quality of the paintings and its role in Ismaili history, it would have been something of significance to him. In 2014, the Aga Khan Museum opened in Toronto with Prince Sadruddin's collection at its core. Next slide, please. Here we have two permanent collection galleries, interconnected spaces without physical boundaries between the sections. Again, showing a sort of a totality of Islamic art. Objects are presented for the most part in geographical groupings, but much like the galleries in Doha, the spaces for each are designed in the same way. They don't try to evoke a geographically specific atmosphere. And South Asia is represented at the end of a series of zones dedicated to Egypt, Syria, and so on. Again, as a curator of South Asian art, I find myself at pains to sensitively situate a collection focusing on the artistic products of the Muslim courts of the region, and objects such as these two manuscripts help tell stories of the arrival and integration of Muslim populations into South Asia, and how the artistic tradition bears witness to this intermingling of traditions. The subtleties of these points can't always be conveyed in the short gallery labels that we're confined to, but we do attempt to indicate how these works represent the multi-ethnic and multi-confessional societies that surrounded their production. And so altogether, I think the main message is that the details of connoisseurship and a parsing of individual artists' careers that characterize the collecting phase of Indian painting shift in importance in the museum presentation phase, as we try to find larger themes to which audiences less familiar with the material might connect. The way the paintings are presented is further informed by the mission of each individual museum, its location in the world, and the way it sees itself in relation to its public. Thank you.
Thank you, Marika, for shedding some light into the depth and diversity of the Indian paintings holdings in these three collections, and the very different ways in which you presented and interpreted them when they were placed before a wide audience. And now I think we will open up our forum for discussion. We do have a few questions, and may we please have all the panelists on screen, please. Okay, so the first question is for you, Gursharan. And I'm actually going to combine two questions into one. We have a member of the audience who's asking me, or asking you rather, are you interested in Sikh paintings? Do you collect Sikh paintings? What advice would you have for a young collector who has started collecting this type of painting or this genre? And what advice would you have for a young collector in general?
Okay, let me take this multi-part question. Am I interested in Sikh paintings? Yes, I am, and I do own actually a number of them. However, several years ago, a very distinguished member of the scientific community, Narendra Kapani, who passed away very recently, told me he was interested in building a collection of Sikh paintings. So I, out of deference to him, stopped collecting Sikh paintings and in fact started directing things to him. So you know what? And then also, probably one of the premier collections in the West has been formed by the Vinder Tour, which is very extensive and wonderful. So I have not been actively buying them, though there is a photograph of my forefather that I would like to buy just because it's of great, great personal value. So that's a long answer to the first question of, do I collect them? I have some, many, but I do not collect them actively anymore. What was the second part of the question again? Remind me.
The second part was, what advice would you have for a young collector who has just started collecting Sikh art or this genre? And what advice would you have for a young collector in general?
Okay, well, I'll combine those two and say the advice is the same. I've sort of indicated stuff. For a Sikh collector, certainly you know Sikh history. If you don't, go read it, because you'll be shown all kinds of things that you need to very carefully be aware of before you buy them. The second admonition or caution would be, which I should actually aim at all of the collectors attempting to collect Indian paintings or Indian art in general, is that with growing interest and increasing prices, the marketplace is awash in forgeries. I'm not saying this for the sake of just dramatic statement, but Anu, you will support me too with this from your perspective. It is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish authentic works from purposeful forgeries. And so, you know, what recourse do you have? Buy from highly reputable dealers, because if later the work is found to be problematic, at least they have their reputation to protect, and they will hopefully compensate you in order to maintain their reputation. Now, don't assume that just because something was owned by a famous collector, that it's authentic. There is a very famous case of someone whose name was mentioned multiple times today, whose collection was sold, and the cover painting of the auction turned out to be problematic and had to eventually be compensated for. So, caveat emptor. What else can I say? Go see paintings in museums. Go get to know curators and reputable dealers. By the way, I'm feeling the pressure of time. I made an omission. The last painting I showed you came from one of my favorite dealers, Francesca Galloway. And in fact, she reminded me not long ago that when she went into dealing in art, I was the person who bought the first thing she saw. So I mentioned a number of very reputable dealers. And of course, you all know Anu by now. So that's the advice I give young collectors. Anu, you have anything to add?
Thank you, Gursharan. I would just add to that you know, the amount of forensics that we do into provenance research, which Brendan touched upon in his presentation as well, that's pretty key in guiding us about, the amount of confidence with which we can present a painting and the amount of confidence with which a buyer could go and acquire it. But thank you for those insights. The questions are flying in fast and thick. Marika, this one to you. The bright art of Thanjavur paintings is missing in many Western museums. Any reason? Might you have any reasons to suggest for that?
I think all three of us could, speak to this and talk, more generally about how there are certain fads or fashions for things at different times, and that certainly there has been a privileging of some Indian schools over others. So part of this is coming from, the scholars side, where really there was for so long an interest in Mughal, Rajasthani, Pahari schools, and now we're slowly broadening out from there. But it also has to do with what's available at any given moment, and what comes on the art market, and what has a kind of provenance that makes it acceptable for a museum to buy. There are certain things that we have to look into and be careful of in a way that safeguards, how these works of art move around the world now. So not everything is necessarily available in the same ways for acquisition. And that has to do with a lot of historical forces as well.
And Marika, do you think some of this is also because this area isn't or hasn't been researched enough? Could that be a reason?
Yes, I think we do see once, sort of someone does a dissertation or publishes a book, or there's a museum exhibition, then suddenly there, market follows, and vice versa. I think this is a symbiotic relationship. So once we now move on to highlighting this school more, I'm sure we'll see it more in museums as well.
Hopefully, yes, that would be super exciting for sure. I'm absolutely loving quite a few of the comments that I'm seeing here on the Q&A chat box. We have many attendees who are personally wishing all of you, our distinguished panelists, the world of Indian paintings. This is a kind of a small world where everyone knows everyone, and it's really like a family. Our family is here this evening to support us and participate. So thank you to everyone for your comments. Next question is for
Anu, before you move on.
Next question.
No, Anu, before you move on. Thanjavur, a very major collection has gone to the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Museum in Mumbai recently, Kamaldeep Singh's collection. It's a very, very major collection. It's been thoroughly researched and published in a special volume in Marg. So the tide has changed. It's not as dismal as we thought before, and people should certainly go and see them there.
Thank you for that interesting tip. We can all go and search for that article then, or that publication by Marg, and look for the paintings when we are next at CSMVS in Bombay. I know I will. Next question is for Brendan. Brendan, Dr. Sidhu actually mentioned that 19th century paintings were shunned by early collectors at some point. Are there any areas in Indian painting that are still overlooked by collectors? So Brendan, as a dealer or as a seller of fine Indian paintings, will you answer that?
Thank you, Anu. Well, I think the 19th century painting is no longer overlooked. But on the second point, I think there's many opportunities to buy in Indian painting generally, and I think what people forget is, of course, in presentations like this, we tend to concentrate on the very highest quality because we want to present things that are the best of their type. But in fact, as everyone knows, you can buy one things I didn't on purpose talk about was values, but you can of course buy very attractive, as you know, Anu, Indian miniature of various different schools for $5,000, $10,000, $2,000, $20,000. You know, not everything is necessarily into six figures. So I think one of the areas that I've always been interested in, and which does sometimes, you know, make serious money, but not normally, is drawings. And I think, you know, from all of the different schools, whether Mughal, Rajput, even South Indian, you know, you do, drawings obviously cost a fraction of what paintings cost, and often tell you, you know, a great deal about technique and about, you know, the paintings themselves. Although, of course, most drawings weren't necessarily preparatory ones for paintings. And I think that is an area really which is quite neglected, and by its nature perhaps is less costly, but it's well worth looking at.
I would actually add to that. Thank you, Brendan. I would add to that and say that, you know, a somewhat comparable collecting category comparable to miniatures or Indian paintings, sorry, I'll get scolded just now by Gursharan, is old master drawings. And I feel that, you know, our area is so undervalued compared to what old master drawings fetch. We have enough scholarship, enough collectors, enough connoisseurship. Why? I think it's very undervalued, this collecting field, and there's a lot of room for growth. Brendan, just for fun, the Guler Basoli Bhagavad page that you showed, I did make a note, sold in 1960 for 15 pounds. And how much would it be worth today?
Well, I think you'd be well into six figures. You know, they have fetched in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, those leaves. You know, they vary obviously, but that of course is a very good one. But you would definitely be into six figures and more.
So that's a nice upward sloping slope in terms of value then of over the last 60 years.
Yes. I'm sorry, the four in the lot generally. I mean, so that lot of 15 pounds on the whole had 3 or 4 of those leaves.
Oh my goodness. So it was actually a group of 3 or 4 for 15 pounds. Yeah. Well, there you are then. Next question. How do you see dealers, collectors, and curators impacting one another? Do changes in the art market affect curating? Do dealers affect the collector's taste? Can you share any personal experiences that illustrate how this ecosystem works? I would like all 3 panelists to answer this, please, each in your own way. Gursharan, we'll start with you.
I have always emphasized the absolutely critical relationship between collectors and dealers. There are a number of reasons. Number one, most of us collectors have rather active professional lives. We're very busy people. You know, you have to make the money to spend it on the art, and you have to fill your life with not just art. So you can't be running around scrounging looking for art that's available. Okay? Although as you travel, you do. It's the dealers who take the risk. They go and find them. They put the money on the line, or their commitment and reputation on the line. And if you build a good relationship with the, as I said, the reputable dealers, and I've mentioned several names today, and I could mention a few more, then the possibility develops, if you are a good customer, treat the dealer well, and the dealer will treat you well, then good things will come to you. Without that, it's very difficult for most people to really go out and find great things and buy them. So that's absolutely critical. Second, I already mentioned, increasingly the worry about forgeries or doctored pictures makes the relationship even more important. The expertise of the dealers who have their reputation to protect is critical, and that's something the collector benefits from. But certainly in the other direction, Brendan can say more about it, but if the collectors didn't buy, the dealers wouldn't be able to buy either. So they're sort of, you know, all commonly understandable things, but it's a relationship that evolves into friendships. If you treat each other well, and if your interests are common. Most really good dealers are themselves at heart collectors. Many of the ones I mentioned are all collectors. And in fact, they quietly secrete away great works that eventually, show up. Remember Sven Garland's auction? I'm only mentioning dealers who are not with us anymore. All the others have things secreted away. Why shouldn't they? I mean, it's like their savings account. So it is the absolute critical relationship.
Thank you, Gursharan. Brendan, over to you. Before we all go and start rummaging in your personal treasure chest, do you want to tell us about what you feel?
Thank you. I think Gursharan has covered most of the points, but I do think that, one's relationship with collectors, most of the people we represent, we have a close relationship with, and we provide valuations for them at different times in their lives. And very often, it takes 20, 25, 30 years before, that great picture you've been waiting for, actually, you get that call and they want to sell it. But also with the curators, one knows quite a lot of them, obviously, those that have bought from us and those who've endeavored to do so. But we also approach those we don't know. And again, you build up a relationship. And very often they're open, they let you know what they're looking for. And so it makes it easy to present things to them when you know precisely what they're looking for. And I think, again, the aspect of provenance, which of course we all have to be, hugely careful about today. But that is a great, this question, where and when did you acquire something? Which it is sometimes quite difficult to get answers, as you know, Anu, to those questions, and whether it's things coming into an auction house or whether it's dealers buying things privately. This is very important. And of course, documentation, is a recent thing. Digital cameras are very recent things. People didn't in the 60s and 70s record their things very well with, things like Polaroid cameras. I mean, those photographs faded, obviously great things were photographed professionally, but it is quite, you do have to take a leaf out of Agatha Christie's book when you come to research some of these things, and it can be very time consuming. But that is of vital importance. So those two questions, when and where was it acquired, are the ones to ask.
Thank you, Brendan. Marika, you had mentioned that you didn't have an opportunity to meet any of the three collectors personally, whose collections you actually interpreted and presented in an institutional context. But would you like to comment anyway about your experience in this regard? How do collectors and curators kind of interact and affect each other's collecting taste and so forth?
Sure. Well, I think I would agree with everything that's been said so far. But, in addition, as far as a curator's own education, and as we all dealers, collectors work towards, continuing the writing of this history, we all have access to different types of works, right? There are things that if working as a curator, you're only looking at other public collections, you would miss out on all kinds of different paintings and, evidence of different kinds of schools that, some dealer working closely with people who haven't made their collections private, have access to and can also share. So I think this is how the symbiotic relationship works, that we're all, sharing different views onto the subject together.
Thank you. Thank you, Marika. Some of the other questions that have come have actually already been answered. There was one about how important it is to know the provenance, and certainly Gursharan and Brendan and Marika, all of you have answered that in different ways. Marika, another one for you. With encountering vast collections, how do you decide what to show? And do you take visitors behind the scenes to show art that you just don't have place to display?
So that is always a very difficult choice to make, what goes out on view and what doesn't, and a whole host of practical things come into play, sizes of showcases, you know, how, whether something can physically, you know, manage to be displayed with paintings if this surfaces are flaking, and so, you know, all these things are in the backs of our minds, aside from a sort of a story that we want to tell. You know, there are a lot of limitations to what eventually goes out on view. So it is wonderful when we can take visitors, and I have been able to do that, show sort of the behind the scenes. Maybe you can't come into the vaults with us, that is generally frowned upon, but we can bring things out that you know, haven't actually seen the light of the galleries, and it's wonderful to see the excitement people have to know, you know, when you feel like you're learning a secret about a museum, but also to be able to look at something without that glass intervening, when you can actually see the surface of the paint, and suddenly there's a connection there, right? That and that's wonderful for us to watch as curators.
No question. I still remember to this day my encounter face to face. Didn't quite get my nose into the painting, but I came close, with an illustration by Mansoor. This was a painting at the Met, and I had the great good fortune to look at it very, very, very close, and I could actually see a single hair on the back of the zebra. It was just you know, my hair is still standing up remembering that. Gursharan, since you are such a you know, connoisseur, and you know, have such a scholarly approach to collecting, what is the connection between, how important it is it to know the connection between a painting and the inscription associated with it?
Ah, you brought up one of my favorite topics. It is absolutely essential, in my opinion, in most cases. The amount of misinterpretation of what a painting is about, because a scholar either who was writing about it either was unable to read the inscription because didn't know how to read that script, or, you know, as Marika has been hinting, they're very busy at museums. There isn't enough time to sort of dig into every single detail. There are numerous cases of completely incorrect interpretations of paintings. Now, secondly, there are tiny inscriptions, and you know, one of my good friends and great scholar, John Seiler, sort of is the most amazing person to see these inscriptions on paintings and accumulating them over a long lifetime of tremendous research. He has created a whole corpus of insights and breakthroughs about individual artists that we didn't even know about. Like there is an artist called Muttam that he has written about. Elvira and I own a painting by Muttam, and he found an inscription on a painting in the Mittal Museum. And from that, the so-called artist called the Jaipur master, about whom Mark Zabrowski had mentioned and written, now has a name. And that's really all about inscriptions. Numerous pages from manuscripts. If you don't read the text and figure out what it says, then people just dismiss them. Brendan, this is in addition to what you've been talking about, all kinds of opportunities. You know, for instance, how many people really know that the earliest Bhakti paintings are from Gujarat? And they go back to the 1400s or perhaps even a little bit earlier. And the only way you find out is you read the inscription illustrating the Bala Gopala Stuti of the baby Krishna. So I think inscriptions are very important. And so I've made so many friends who are experts at various scripts And in fact, right now I'm struggling to have Telugu and Kannada inscriptions read, and some of them have Sanskrit underneath with their Telugu script. These are really very complex issues, but we have to figure them out.
Absolutely. I think that's been a game changer, if I might use that word, in the scholarship of this category. And if there are any experts out there who can read Telugu or Kannada, please do let us know so that we can connect you with Gursharan.
By the way,
Well,
we should also put a caution on this inscriptions thing. Too many spurious inscriptions are being added now. Since we are reading inscriptions to enhance the value of paintings, suddenly the name of an artist, a famous artist, shows up on something. And when you really look hard, it certainly isn't the handwriting of anyone associated with that artist. So it goes both ways.
Absolutely. Well, this was such an enjoyable and engaging journey into the world of Indian paintings, which we all love. We have a few more questions. I'm sorry that all good things must end, so I must bring this discussion to a close. Before I end, my heartfelt thanks to our panelists for your time and participation, to my colleagues on the Asia Week New York Planning Committee for your encouragement, your help, Margaret Tao in particular. A very special thanks to Lark Mason and his team for their excellent technical support. And thank you to our audience. I hope you've enjoyed this evening. Please do follow Asia Week New York online so that you can keep abreast of the many exciting programs and events that the consortium is hosting year-round. Over the past year, COVID-19 has caused so much disruption and tragedy in all our lives. At the same time, it has increased by 100-fold the reach of technology, making possible an event such as the one we've just had, where we've hosted speakers and audience members from 2 continents and at least 3 time zones. It's well past bedtime for some of us, close to tea time for others, and definitely gin and tonic time for a few. Most importantly, though, in the world of the Indian paintings that we have just visited, this is Godhuli, the hour of cow dust, when Lord Krishna brings the cows home from pasture. It is dusk and all is at peace in this world. On that peaceful and auspicious note, I will bring this evening to a close. Thank you and good night.
Good night.